Hi, everybody. I'm sorry for my voice. I'm a little bit sick, but I really care about this lesson because in this module we will focus on European citizenship. And more specifically, today I would like to speak to you about the legacy of two founding women of Europe. Uh, and so about Simone Weil and Louise Weiss in order to examine the political, cultural, and civic legacy of two emblematic figures of 20th century Europe who played a leading role in shaping a European identity built on historical memory, rights, solidarity, and unity. Like Helmut Kohl, Simone Weil was part of the European political class, which took up the legacy of the fathers and mothers of the idea of a united, democratic, and supportive Europe, working to keep it alive through the institutions conceived at the end of the Second World War. Institutions that needed to evolve in order to prevent the risk that with their demise, the hope of a community founded on peace and rights might also fade away. So, as we know, both of them belong to the category of the fathers and mothers of the idea of Europe, those born between the late 19th and the early 20th century who witnessed the military horrors of the First World War, yet could do nothing to prevent the causes of the first global conflict from erupting again in a second, even more devastating war. So, this category includes statesmen such as Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, Paul-Henri Spaak, Alcide De Gasperi, Grand Commis like Jean Monnet, but also men and women of thought and action who laid the ideal foundations of Europeanist and federalist movements, without which the institution designed by the statesmen could never have evolved and endured. And I mean Altiero Spinelli, Ernesto Rossi, and Eugenio Colorni in Italy, Albert Camus in France, Sophie Scholl and the White Rose Group in Germany, and déracinés such as Ursula Hirschman and Alexander Mark, George Goraili, and Denis de Rougemont. To this category of déraciné thinkers, one might also add Hannah Arendt for the strength political of her political theory. Simone Weil thus belongs to the class of militants for the European cause who, as adolescents, lived through and, in her case, endured directly the horrors of the Second World War, and who emerged with the conviction that their commitment had to rest upon two simple words: never again. But let's briefly review some aspects of her story. Simone Jacob was born on the 13th of July 1927 into a Jewish family in Nice, in France. In 1944, she was arrested with her family and deported to the Nazi concentration camps of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Bobrek, and finally Bergen-Belsen. She and her two sisters survived while her parents and brother perished in the camps. And in May 1945, she returned to Paris, where she began studying law and political science. In 1946, she married Antoine Weil. What about her early political career? Simone Weil became a magistrate, and in this role, advised various ministers of justice, including François Mitterrand. In 1970, she became the first woman to serve as Secretary General of the High Council of the Judiciary, um, the so-called in French le Conseil supérieur de la magistrature. And it is said that when Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was elected the president of the French Republic in April 1974, he went to the home of Antoine Veil to invite him to join the new government. Once there, he decided not to appoint Antoine, but his wife Simone instead. So Simone Veil entered Giscard d'Estaing's government as Minister of Health. Soon after her appointment, she waged a fierce battle for the legislation on abortion in France, which was only won when the opposition in the National Assembly rallied to her cause, leading to the approval of the law in 1975. The legislation was seen as such a landmark achievement that it became known as the Veil Law. But as a Holocaust survivor, Simone could not comprehend how one European country could wage war against another. As her political career in France developed, her commitment to the idea of a Europe where such atrocities could never be repeated grew stronger. Thus, when in 1979 President Giscard d'Estaing asked her to lead his party in the first direct elections to the European Parliament, she did not hesitate. So Simone Veil was elected to the European Parliament, which chose her as its president, making her both the first person to preside over a directly elected parliament and the first woman to head any EU institution. And she also chaired the Legal Affairs Committee and served on the committees on environment, political affairs, and foreign affairs and security, as well as the subcommittee on human rights. She was also member of the Special Committee on German Unification set up in 1990. During her parliamentary career, she served as both president and vice president of the Liberal and Democratic Group, later renamed the Liberal and Democratic Reformist Group. In 1981, she received the Charlemagne Prize, awarded in recognition of significant contributions to European unity. Well, after 14 years in the European Parliament, in 1993, Simone Veil returned to the French politics as Secretary of State and Minister of Health and Social Affairs until 1995. In 1998, she was appointed to the French Constitutional Council, and from 2001 to 2007, she served as first president of the Fondation pour la mémoire de la Shoah, the Foundation for the Memory of the Shoah. In 2005, she campaigned in favor of the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe. Really sorry. In 2008, when she was elected to the Académie Française, Simone Veil, that was one of the few women to receive this honor, chose to have engraved on the ceremonial sword presented to each member three symbols: Auschwitz tattoo number, that was 78651, the motto of the French Republic, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, and the motto of the European Union, United in Diversity. So in 2011, the square in front of the main building of the European Parliament in Brussels was named Agora Simone Veil in her honor. And in 2012, she was awarded the Grand Cross of the Légion d'honneur. Following her death on the 30th of June 2017, the president of the European Parliament, at the time, Antonio Tajani, paid tribute to Simone Veil, calling her a great president of the European Parliament. He said also the conscience of the European Union, an activist anti-Semitism and a champion of women's rights. So he said that her message on women and against anti-Semitism remains as relevant today as ever. Since July 2018, her remains have been interred in the Pantheon in Paris. Only 4 other women before her had been granted this honor. So the life and ideas of Simone Veil were widely recalled and commented upon in the days following her passing. Everyone remembered that Simone Veil had been the first president of the European Parliament, elected by universal suffrage in July 1979, though all too often the snapshot of her European story stops there. Simone Veil entered the European Parliament as the lead candidate of the Union for French Democracy movement, created in 1974 by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, then President of the French Republic, and the natural place for the 25 deputies of the UDF was the Liberal group, the 5th largest in the Strasbourg and Luxembourg hemicycle, after the Socialists, the Christian Democrats, the Conservatives, especially British, the Communists and their allies, and ahead of the Gaullists. But according to the national logic of left-right polarization, the political groups sought 2 alternative candidates. And I mean, Mario Zagari, chosen by the socialists, fully aware that his candidacy was merely symbolic, and the center-right had initially leaned towards the Luxembourger Gaston Thorn, since the Christian Democrats opposed Simone Veil because of her association with the abortion law, and the German opposed a French candidate. Yet, in the secrecy of the liberal ballot, Simone Veil prevailed, and she was then officially elected by the Assembly with the support of the Liberals, the Christian Democrats, Conservatives, and part of the Gaullists, essentially the center-right coalition, opposed to the Socialist Communist coalition. It is very likely that some defecting Christian Democrats were offset by the almost unanimous votes of the few women deputies in the Assembly and by some German Social Democrats loyal to the Giscard-Schmidt friendship, even though Giscard's claim that Veil's election was the result of a UDF and SPD agreement does not match historical reality. Well, it is significant that in her inaugural address, Simone Veil placed the emphasis on 3 major issues of contention with the Council that we will see at the end of this lesson. One, own resources, that is European taxes, the Parliament's role in legislative activity, and budget reform, effectively moving beyond their artificial left-right opposition. So in this conflict between the community vision and intergovernmental logic, Simone Veil attempted unsuccessfully to lay the groundwork for Europeanist Rassemblement in France, and that could overcome the socialist left ideological reluctance and the Gaullist rights hostility. So in the end, however, she had to submit to the left-right cleavage, standing in the 1984 elections at the head of a joint Veil-Chirac list in an anti-Mitterrand campaign. So the first year of the first European legislature closed with a rebellion of parliament against the council. The assembly rejected the majority, the budget decided by governments for 1980, and despite pressure from the French and German governments, Simone Veil was signed in mid-December the decision, leaving the communities without an acceptable budget until May 30 of the 1980. What followed this budget revolt is well known to Europeans. The governments, strengthened by the powers granted to them by treaties, imposed an even worse budget than the one the parliament has rejected. This paved the way for an initiative known as the Cocodril Club, which, under the impetus of Altiero Spinelli, led the Assembly to vote on the 14th of February 1984 for the treaty establishing the European Union. I'm really, really sorry that I got sick, but the show must go on. During her presidency, cut short halfway through the legislature, despite the campaign to extend their mandate until 1984, Simone Veil consistently defended the prerogatives of the elected European Parliament, supporting the early steps of Spinelli's constitutional project. So it is worth revisiting a portrait written by Alfredo Spinelli in his diary that I think that describes Simone Veil. And he said, and I try to read this passage. During lunch, I observed the president. She is a tense woman, incapable of a gesture of good humor or irony. She hardly ever smiles. This assertive demeanor, yet in essence an awareness of having committed herself completely without reserve to her mission, and therefore determined never to be distracted, I have encountered in some men, but more often in women in politics. Was somewhat like that when she was engaged in politics. I believe this stems from the sense such a committed woman as of standing on ground still essentially hostile. She feels the men around her sneering, ready to mock her if at any moment she falls short of expectations. I admire this concentrated willpower and courage. So, after this brief description of her life and her as a president and what the other thought about her, um, and the impression that she gave to other people, let me introduce you Louise Weiss. Louise Weiss was born in Arras, in France, on the 25th of January, 1893, and she was the eldest of 6 children in an upper middle class family of mixed Protestant and Jewish background. Her father, Paul Louis Weiss, was an engineer in the mining industry, while her mother, Jeanne, descended from the influential Javal family, originally from Alsace. Jeanne supported their daughter's wish to study, And Louise excelled academically. And in 1914, she passed the agrégation, that is the competitive exam granting access to the public administration. She graduated in literature from the universities of Paris and Oxford before the First World War began to dominate her thoughts. Driven by the desire to contribute to the war effort, Louise Weiss returned to France to set up a small military hospital in Brittany for wounded soldiers and to establish a home for refugees. After the war ended, she traveled to Switzerland and to care for former French prisoners of war and wrote a report on how they were treated in German camps, which was published in the newspaper Le Radical and um, and was published under the pseudonym of Louis Lefranc. And for Louise, journalism was a tool to wage war. So, since women were then excluded from politics in France, she wrote to give voice to her views and to promote causes close to her heart, such as peace and equality. And in January 1918, together with fellow journalist and editor Hyacinthe Philouz, she founded the weekly L'Europe Nouvelle, which soon became an important and respected journal of international politics. In 1919, she also became a correspondent for the Paris daily Le Petit Parisien. And while she continued to be a strong advocate for peace, her pacifist stance weakened for Hitler's rise to power in Germany in the 1930s. So the presentment policy pursued by the League of Nations alarmed Louise Weiss, who began supporting the use of force to secure peace. In 1934, she therefore left L'Europe Nouvelle. So her attention then turned to women's rights, and in particular um, to women's suffrage, which she believed could help to prevent war. So she founded a new organization, La Femme Nouvelle, whose objective was to obtain the vote for women. So as war with Germany became inevitable, Louise Weiss, that was one of the few journalists to devote particular attention to the Nazi persecution of political dissidents and Jews, used her influence to persuade the foreign ministers Georges Bonnet to create in December 1938 a government-sponsored refugee committee to assist Jewish fleeing the Nazis. She also helped secure French visas for 1,000 Jewish children from Germany and Austria after Kristallnacht, and for several hundred refugees stranded on the transatlantic ships Saint Louis and Flandre to settle temporarily in France after being turned away by the United States. So when French under Nazi occupation in 1940, life became increasingly difficult and dangerous for Louise Weiss and her family. And in 1943, after her brother narrowly escaped the arrest on charges of aiding the resistance, Louise Weiss herself went underground and joined the resistance, publishing the clandestine newspaper La Nouvelle République. After the war, for nearly a decade, she traveled the world, writing numerous articles for leading French newspapers and journals about the prominent role of the West and Europe in particular should play in promoting democratic values globally. So this convention led her to defend Europe's role as a counterbalance to the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In 1971, she founded the Foundation Louis Weiss, which awarded the annual prize for to individuals or institutions that had contributed most to the advancement of the science of peace. And among its recipients were Václav Havel, Helmut Schmidt, and Simone Weil. And with her focus increasingly on Europe, Louis Weiss was elected to the European Parliament in 1979, and at the age of 86, delivered the inaugural address at its first session. So in her speech, she urged all European citizens to unite driven by a shared culture rather than by mere economic interests. So Louise Weiss remained a member of the European Parliament until her death at the age of 1983, making her its oldest serving deputy. And after her death, the main building of the European Parliament in Strasbourg was dedicated to her in recognition of her unwavering commitment to European values. So we can say she was one, no one, and a million, because she was a prominent journalist and a writer, as we said. She also had a European commitment because helped spread the idea of a united Europe long before the creation of the European Union. And also, she was elected, as I said, in 1979. She promoted cooperation among European states and the building of common institutions based on peace, democracy, and solidarity. And also, her life was an example of consistency between ideals and action. And she challenged the social conventions and political barriers to affirm freedom and women's rights. And the European Parliament building in Strasbourg houses an auditorium named after her as a tribute to her impact on European politics. So, having briefly outlined the lives of these two pioneers, I would now like to shine a light on the historic event of their speeches on the 17th and 18th of July 1979, which I shall attempt to summarize to you. Well, the speeches of these two women were given in the same chamber and before the same assembly, the first European Parliament elected by direct universal suffrage. Only 24 hours apart, they marked a historic turning point. Louis Weiss and Simone Veil were 34 years apart. That day, Louise, at the age of 86, was old enough to serve as the Dean of the Assembly, with the right and duty to preside over the session until the election of a new president. That president was to be Simone Veil, then 52 years old, who would speak the day after Weiss's memorable address. Between one speech and the other, the chronicles and photographs of the time record a warm embrace between the two women, a gesture easy to understand. Both were French, both Jewish, though without strong religious ties, and both had gone very far in their critique of nation states, saying in extreme nationalism the inevitable root of recurring wars. Both recognized in a supranational Europe the only path to peaceful coexistence among countries that had fought each other for centuries, culminating in the 20th century barbarity of the Holocaust. Yet the embrace also symbolized the passing of the torch from the epic heroic adventures utopian phase of early 20th century Europeanism, lived between the two wars by Louis Weiss, writer, traveler, filmmaker, feminist, pacifist, tireless journalist of La Nouvelle Europe, and founder of the École de la Paix, the more political, concrete, and institutional phase which Simone Weil would have to manage daily amid budget battles, government conflicts, and political obstruction. So it is as if these two speeches narrated Europe's passage from myth to vote, from dream to reality. So Louis Weiss' speech delivered by someone who called herself in love with Europe was the most beautiful ever spoken in the Strasbourg chamber. Marvelous roll call of the ancient and masters who shine Europe's history and who in fact shaped its cultural identity. Legendary figures who emerged from the mists of history to be honored as they deserved by the newly elected assembly, from Charlemagne to Dante, from Shakespeare to Grotius, the internationally recognized the father of human rights, to Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet, fathers of Europe. So Louis Weiss recounted the heart of what it means to be European, along with the awareness and pride needed to build a common future. So institutions alone, she argued, were not enough because community institutions have made sugar beets, butter, cheese, calves, and even European pigs, but they have not made European men. Those men, she insists, must be remade. So this indeed was the task before Simone Veil, the first president of the first European Parliament elected by the people, a former Auschwitz deportee who had lost her parents and a brother in the Holocaust and who thus became, through her election, the very symbol of reconciliation between French and Germans. Well, in her address, Simone Veil called for the creation of Europe of solidarity, the Europe of independence and cooperation, a community founded on shared heritage and common respect for fundamental human values, capable of meeting three major challenges: peace, freedom, and prosperity. But she went further still. A magistrate, a minister, and an institutional leader. She knew well the institutional challenge posed in July 1979 by the birth of the European Parliament. What real room for maneuver would the new assembly have given the function of initiative on the one hand and of legislative decision making on the other are entrusted by the treaties to the Commission and the Council? On which issues, in which policies decided by the Council and the Commission would the Parliament be able to make its voice heard with the new authority conferred upon it by universal suffrage? These were no small questions. Simone Veil outlined them with visionary clarity, anticipating in her speech what within a few months would become a genuine institutional crisis, the conflict over the approval of the 1980 community budget, which would lead the parliament to call for a new constituent phase. She said that they did not believe that the strictly institutional limitations of its competencies can prevent a parliament such as theirs from making its voice heard at any time and on any aspect of community action. She called for a mutual cooperation among the community and institution, unlimited consultations, and a new procedure of consultation to enable Parliament to participate effectively in the legislative decision of the community. So the democratic question and the issue of the legitimacy of transferring state sovereignty to a supranational authority, together with decision-making procedures within the Union's legal order, have shaped the history of the European project since its very origins. So the composition and powers of the European Parliament have always been the decisive point of public debate on the democratic nature of European decision-making processes and institutions. So today, the treaty explicitly states that the functioning of the Union is founded on representative democracy, and that citizens are directly represented at the Union level in the European Parliament. So the entire system of mechanisms and instruments of participation designed to ensure this democratic legitimacy of European public authority thus finds its fulcrum in European Parliament. Starting from the Parliament means returning to and rediscovering Europe as a community before it is a union. So it is also the institution that embodies an ideal cultural and political and generational relay between two women presidents of the first directly elected European Parliament. So the European Parliament is the institution that represents the citizens of the Union who elected by universal, free, and secret suffrage. In addition to its consultative and supervisory roles, it exercises jointly with the Council legislative and budgetary functions. So the definition of its prerogatives reflects the culmination of a long process of political and institutional evolution, mirroring the entire path of European integration. And in fact, when the 1951 treaty establishing the European Coal and Steel Community included an assembly with the consultative functions, it gave the contracting parties the choice between members designated by national parliaments or directly elected representatives. And the system of delegation was later reaffirmed in Article 138 of the Treaty of Rome, establishing the European Economic Community, which provided for an assembly composed of members designated by the national parliaments from among their own members. At the same time, the assembly was tasked with the parliaments from among their own members. Although member states choose the first option, the principle of direct elections to the assembly was therefore already contemplated in European project from the outset. A convention signed alongside the treaties of Rome also provided that the parliamentary assembly would be a common institution for all the three communities. Meeting for the first time in Strasbourg in 1958, the assembly decided 4 years later to call itself the European Parliament. That was a title that formally introduced into the treaties only in 1986 with a single European Act. So since the Assembly's function were essentially consultative, many consider the direct elections to be of secondary importance. At the same time, European elections were strongly opposed by those such as Charles de Gaulle and Georges Pompidou, who viewed with suspicion both the strengthening of the community dimensions over the intergovernmental one in the decision-making process and the empowerment of the parliamentary institutions in the absence of an executive with sufficient balancing powers. So, it was Altiero Spinelli who forcefully highlighted the importance of popular elections and as an indispensable source of legitimacy for expanding the competences of European Parliament in its vision within the institutional triangle in which the European legislative and decision-making process takes shape. Parliament elected by direct universal suffrage derives from its popular legitimacy a permanent constituent function, which combined with its independence from national governments makes it the institution best suited to express and implement the process of integration. But the push for direct elections to the European Parliament thus matured with the broader debate on the future of European integration. And as the integration process deepened, the need to strengthen its democratic legitimacy also grew. And at the same time, direct election increased the authority of the European Parliament, bolstering its long struggle to secure equal powers with the Council in the legislative process. Well, in line with the provision of the provision of Article 223 of the treaty, in November 2015, the European Parliament approved the proposal to reform the EU electoral law aimed, among other things, at enhancing the democratic and supranational dimension of European elections and strengthening the principles of electoral equality and equal opportunities. Respect for the democratic principle in the Union's legal order concerns not only the election of member of the parliament, but also the distribution of seats among the member states. And the treaty provides that the European Parliament shall have 750 members plus the president, and that representation of citizens shall be digressively proportional, with a minimum threshold of 6 seats and a maximum of 96 seats for per member state. So the criterion used is essentially demographic, since the number of seats allocated to each state is proportional to its population. The corrective mechanism provided by the minimum and the maximum seat contingents is intended to balance the need for state representation with the requirement for the institution to function effectively, avoiding excessive dominance by certain national delegations. So the effect of this allocation system is an overrepresentation of smaller states and consequently a disproportionate ratio between member of the parliaments and the number of union citizens they represent. So in this regard, the German Constitutional Court, in its June 2009 ruling on the constitutional legitimacy of ratifying the Lisbon Treaty, held that despite the reformulation of Article 14 of the treaty, and contrary to Article 10 of the treaty, the European Parliament does not represent the European people, since it does not guarantee representation of Union citizens in accordance with the principle of electoral equity. So this critical observation, however, do not undermine the institutional political specificities that make the European Parliament a fundamental institution for democratic legitimacy of the Union and for citizens' participation in European decision-making. Before Lisbon Treaty, we can say that members of the parliament were described as representatives of the peoples of states brought together in the community. Today, the explicit reference to union citizenship underscores the unitary dimension of the representation of the European people, whose interests are autonomous and distinct from the sum of interests of the individual national peoples. And at the same time, the concept of the union citizenship embodies not only a set of rights, but also a common identity that European Parliament is called upon to represent and safeguard. So it should also be recalled that the European Parliament was the first supranational institution to acquire autonomous democratic legitimacy through direct universal suffrage. And also the principle of democracy and popular sovereignty thus found direct affirmation in the international sphere, a political dimension traditionally dominated by relations between nation states represented by their governments. So the European Parliament is the institution that directly represents the citizens of the Union, and its equal participation with the Council in adopting legislation significantly reduced the democratic deficit typical of the international organization. Well, we can say that for the first time in history, so Europeans elected with their representatives together in a common assembly. Simone Veil stressed that Europe faced, as I said before, three major challenges: peace, freedom, and prosperity, which could only be met by uniting forces. And she, I took some pieces of her speech. For reason of time, it was not possible to read the entire speech, but I tried to highlight what I believe to be the most significant passage. So I will read them because I really think that it is important to imagine to be in that chamber, in that room, and to listen to these words as the words from the first woman to be president, and also for the first time as president of a directly elected parliament. We start from Louis Weiss because if you listen to me, these speeches were on the 17th and on 18th of July. The first one to speak was Louis Weiss on the 17th, and after her solemn introduction and her review of the major milestones in Europe's history, Louis Weiss turned to some pressing issues. And she said, for what sad reasons should your assembly live with its eyes fixed only on the treaties of Paris and Rome? Without contravening them, it could, in its moral sovereignty over European public affairs, make its own the crucial problems that transcends those treaties and are even more important than those of currency and energy. I have identified three. The first is a problem of identity, not an identity understood as uniformity, but as a deep awareness of self. The insufficient participation of the European electorate in the vote that brought us here shows how urgent this issue is. It is impossible to conceive of a Europe without Europeans. So, first one, identity. Second, demographics. And she said, at the rate at which couples are having children, soon there will be no more Europeans, very soon. Then why this assembly? The statistics are frightening, both in form and in substance. When experts tell me that German women bear only 1.4 and French women only 1.8 of the 2.28 children needed, I shudder, imagining thousands of infants cut into pieces. I share the anguish of this long agony expressed in figures about our civilization, how to revive it, how to renew it. Only together we can succeed. So, identity, demographics, and the third problem, the rule of law and the human rights. We will see um, a, a side of the rule of law in the next lesson. And she said, these had been shipwrecked in Europe together with the League of Nations and with the occupation of our continent by the Nazi dictatorship. Identity, demographics, legality. Europe will not regain its splendor without rekindling these beacons, the beacons of conscience, life, and law. You hold their sparks. I pronounce these words in full awareness of the nuclear danger that surrounds us. Our planet spins, overarmed, engaged in a third war hidden here, first there, insidious and polymorphic. The documents I receive do not persuade me that disarmament has begun except on paper, while nuclear science spreads. The danger has grown so great as to exceed even the fear it inspires. If couples fully understood it, they would have no more children. Already some peoples, more imaginative than others, have turned themselves into myths, building formidable underground cities to withstand impacts and radiations. Already shelters are being prepared. Yet, honorable colleagues, one possibility of salvation remains, and your moral authority as Europeans, united against such a cataclysm, can make it greater. The possibility lies in this: it is not weapons that kills, but men. So, amazing speech. And the day after, Simone Veil spoke. Last night, I already expressed the gratitude we owe to the Honorable Louise Weiss, who so firmly guided our first steps. Allow me to recall her once more to underline the leading role she played in all struggles for women's emancipation. Beyond being a duty, it is also a honor for me to pay tribute to the assembly that preceded ours, and in particular to the presidents who succeeded one another, conducting its work with the authority we all acknowledge. And then she continues, and whatever innovation is represented by our direct universal suffrage, our assembly must above all see itself as the heir of the parliamentary assemblies that preceded it. We take our place in the firm path traced by all those who for a generation sat on these benches when the European idea met the democratic principle. So, for the first time in history, Europeans have elected their representatives together in a common assembly, an act described as a true milestone in the construction of Europe. Admittedly, each state still follows different electoral procedures, but the ultimate goal is to establish uniform rules. So, we said that Louis Weiss said identity, demographics, and rule of law, legacy. Simone Veil stresses that this election comes at a crucial moment and that Europe must confront three major challenges: peace, freedom, and prosperity. Peace, because although Europe has enjoyed a period of stability, ongoing local conflicts around the world reveal how fragile this achievement really is. Freedom, because Europe is surrounded by totalitarian regimes and must remain an island of liberty, proudly welcoming countries such as Greece, Spain, and Portugal, which joined after the fall of their dictatorships. Prosperity. The oil crisis has exposed the continent's economic and social vulnerabilities, and only by acting together can Europeans safeguard their standard of living. So, according to Simone Veil, these challenges can only be met by uniting the forces, since no single European state is strong enough to face the superpowers alone. So the new elected parliament, therefore, carries a responsibility, must pursue three objectives: a Europe of solidarity among peoples, regions, and citizens, reducing social and economic disparities and focusing on employment; a Europe of independence, especially in monetary and energy matters, to avoid dependence on external forces such as dollar or oil producing countries; a Europe of cooperation, promoting closer coordination among governments and investing in new forms of energy and research. And that on the role of Parliament, which forms the foundation of the entire discussion on Parliament addressed in the module on democratic participation, an issue that is more relevant than ever today and particularly sensitive when it comes to one of the most delicate matters: the budget. Simone Veils highlighted that in the new global economic context, Europe must strengthen its cooperation with the developing countries, taking into account the inequalities between those that produce raw materials and those that do not. So Europe must secure the resources it needs, offer fair conditions to its partners, and ensure a level playing field for its own enterprises. So with a directly universal suffrage, the European Parliament has gained a new authority and with it a special responsibility. Mm, to address today's challenges and not disappoint the expectation of the citizens who elected it. This responsibility translates mainly into two directions: exercising its supervisory role in a more democratic way and reinforcing its driving role in European integration. So a central issue concerns the budget, because it is the parliament's most important task and it has the power to amend or even reject it. Since the budget is financed through own resources, Parliament must not only focus on expenditures but also take revenues into account in line with the historical tradition of all democratic parliaments. So, furthermore, Parliament must make its voice heard in a very area of community action without being constrained by institutional limits. So while respecting the autonomy of the Commission and the Council, it should work in collaboration with them and use its democratic legitimacy to give fresh impetus to the European project. So in short, the directly elected European Parliament must become a decisive actor, overseeing policies, managing the budget responsibly, fostering solidarity among citizens, and cooperating with other institutions to advance European unity in tangible ways. So, what we can say mm, um, beside that, I believe that in this opening speech we can grasp the very essence of the importance of these two women in building a sense of citizenship and belonging, one that is above all grounded in the direct participation through voting. Because from the principle of no taxation without representation, and therefore from the democratic legitimacy of the representative and fiscal body, we then move to focus to the focus on revenues, and consequently to the importance of a multi-level solidarity. We can finally say about these two women that in relation to their role as founding women of a united Europe, that Louise Weiss had a concrete commitment to a united Europe. She first directly elected member of European Parliament. She had a feminist vision, and one of the 3 points of her speech was about legacy. And Simone Veil had an ethical and social thought. She placed justice, human dignity, and the defense of the most vulnerable at the heart of European reflection. She also had an active engagement through the French resistance. She embodied the values of the civic responsibility and solidarity, and the influence on European values, but also the legacy. Simone Weil represents the European ideal of shared principles of ethical awareness, respect for the human person at the basis of political coexistence. But we can say to end this lesson that I hope you will join and loved as I did when I thought about these two women, that Louise Weiss was a concrete founder. She contributed to building the institutional framework of Europe. Simone Veil was a value-based founder, inspired the moral and social principles on which Europe is founded. So their legacy, together they represent the institutional and ethical roots of modern Europe, showing that the European project is not only a project, but also it's moral and social. I really, excuse, and I'm sorry because I was sick. So I hope that this lesson was clear, especially for my voice. And thank you for your kind attention, and see you very, very soon.